My name is O'Shea Bell. I'm born and raised in the Bronx, New York. I have over a decade in boarding school experience. I went to two different boarding schools, both Kent Hill and the Taft School, and then I've also worked at two different boarding schools, both Kent Hill and Lawrence Academy. After boarding school, I ended up playing football and graduating from Stonehill College out of Easton, Massachusetts. And now I'm currently the assistant dean of students at Lawrence Academy. I'm also the son of the CEO and founder of the Guerrilla Prince Fitness and Athletics. Derek Bell's my father. I guess I should add that too, right? Yeah, I think what made me want to go to boarding school is the fact that like I had the opportunity and privilege to see my older brother go to boarding school first. My older brother, he went to Trinity Paulding in Paulding, New York. I also had two older cousins who also went to two different boarding schools, both the Hunt School in Berkshire. And but I didn't really have a good scope with my cousins rather than when my older brother went to Trinity Poland, I was able to see him, on campus, dorm life, him making friends and, just enjoying the experience outside of a school in the Bronx. He was getting that real college feel before he was actually in college, on campus. And so just seeing him and the opportunities and doors that opened up for him during that process, it made me want to do it as well. And then being associated with the Boys Club in New York, really sort of, opened our eyes as well. The Boys Club in New York is a great organization, out of New York that, gives opportunity to, young men from our community, from, the inner city of New York, giving them the opportunity to, see the boarding school experience and just seeing everything that the boarding school experience has to offer. And, so having all of those perspectives and all of those people and organizations really sort of gave me a better scope of, me understanding the boarding school experience and, sort of opening my eyes to, taking it on for myself. Yeah, I would say definitely just stepping outside of my comfort zone. I mean, and that happened first day on campus. I got there for preseason football. I started playing football. I never played football a day in my life. So, I'm, 100 pounds soaking wet, playing varsity football, at my school. And so that was the first thing, so, and that just opened up a ton of opportunities, experience. And then, just getting involved in the community, getting involved in clubs, just meeting new people, not really trying to stay in my shell. I'm a pretty outgoing person. I'm definitely an extrovert, you know what I mean? So it wasn't really that hard for me to get acclimated, but I definitely did take advantage of everything that the campuses had to offer. I did plays, you know what I mean? I did plays at Kent Hill. When I was at TAF, I was in the improv club, you know what I mean? Those were just a couple of things that I did to really just get the most out of the experience because the amount of connections and the people that you connect with on these campuses, some of those connections just they last a lifetime, and my boarding school friends are honestly some of my best friends that I have today. Yeah, and then to answer your other point, how do you get the most out of the experience of the boarding school? How do you get the most out of the boarding school experience? I would say, and this, ties into what you just asked as well, and just taking advantage of the luxury of having teachers and faculty that are literally there with you 24/7. Like, you have the opportunity to see your teacher both in the classroom, could see them in the dining hall. You probably see them in the sports. You probably see them on your court or whatever. Then you probably see them in the dorm later on. Like, so you have the luxury of being with one of your educators 24/7. So, it may annoy them sometime, but you can ask them about your homework at dinner. You can ask them about, your homework on the practice field. You're not supposed to, but, just things like that and just having that connection with them. I will say one class that always stood out for me, and I've told him this a million times. He hates that I tell. I don't know. Is Mr. Munson still at Kent Hill?
He's not. He actually recently just retired, but he was there my freshman year.
Dang. I gotta hit him up. So Munson, Mr. Munson was my junior year physics teacher, and I've always told him he was the best teacher I've ever had in my entire life. Mr. Munson and I did not get along my first 2 years at Kent Hill. Not gonna lie, we did not get along. I was he Munson is a retired Navy man, you know what I mean? Pretty clean cut, straight up dude. And I was not I didn't really fit into that, into that realm when I came onto that campus. And it wasn't until I took his class that I really appreciated him and everything that he was really trying to instill in me on that campus and just as a man in general. And then he made that class so fun to learn. Like I was actually like yearning to go to that class. And that was not, I would say there weren't too many classes that I really was, excited to go to. But his physics class really stood out. I always say like he was the best teacher I've ever had. That was the best course I've ever been in. I remember one project specifically we did with I think it was projectile motion. I forget what it was, but it was basically you had a ball and had to go through this ramp. You had to measure the ramp. You had to, measure, weigh the ball, the speed, all these things. And the ball would drop on a target. The middle bullseye was an A, then you had a B, C, and wherever the ball dropped, you got one chance to drop that ball. And wherever a ball dropped down that ramp was your grade. And that project always set out for me, no big deal. I did get an A. I actually was the reason we got an A because my partner was about to measure something different or like do a formula that we wasn't supposed to do. I remember this like yesterday. And yeah, but managed to get an A. Mr. Munson was really one of the teachers. So then when I went to go back to Kent Hill and I was teaching there, I had the opportunity not only to, now I'm connecting with him on a colleague level rather than a student to teacher level. And it was just amazing, man. I always give him a shout out. He hates when I do it, but I always give that man a shout out in terms of like being the best teacher I've ever had. Yeah, definitely living on campus with my students. Like I said, it's definitely a different experience, but at the end of the day, the reason why I do this job is to provide the best experience for these students, provide the best opportunities for these young kids as they move through their high school journey. And so I try to make myself as available as possible to my students, whether it's class or anything else. I work in student life, so my job is solely based on the whole student experience residentially, academically, socially, athletically. I'm a faculty member who is involved in, a student's entire experience, at Lawrence Academy. And so me being able to make sure that my door is open when I'm on duty, or me making sure that I give students an opportunity to meet me, during study hall or, in between classes or, on a weekend, if, we have a long distance boarder who's still on campus that I can help them out with, anything like that. Um, Basically I just try to make sure that I'm giving the best experience possible and trying to make sure that they're getting the most out of the experience. You know what I mean? I saw how valuable it was for those faculty members who were on campus who, it made it seem like, oh, this faculty member is always working. You know what I mean? This faculty member is like never off, never off duty. And, so I try my best, I try to make sure I do have a balance, but I try my best to make sure that I'm giving that experience to these students because it in the long run, these are the things that they remember. Oh, I mean, I was it made it so easy. If that makes sense. It made it so easy. Like the rigor of, the boarding school schedule, both academically, socially, athletically, it prepared me, more than anything for college. When my first year, in college, when the freshmen had study hall, like, a lot of my teammates didn't even know how to, what to do during study. Like this was already a schedule that I've been acclimated to and I've been a part of for 5 years, and so it helped a lot. It helped a lot, time management, being alone away from home. I didn't have my parents, over my shoulder saying, all right, you got to make sure you do your homework. You got to make sure you do this, you got to make sure you do that. You know what I mean? So I I didn't, in terms of getting acclimated into college and, that transition, it was there, to be honest, it really was no transition. I was already, away from home. I was already, handling, my schoolwork on my own, athletically, taking care of myself, things like that, like small things like just taking care of yourself, not even in the classroom or athletically, just hygiene, like things like that. You learn at the boarding school, to really take accountability for yourself and just making sure that you're doing all those things, socially, emotionally, physically, everything, all of those things you're taking care of on your own during the boarding school experience. So once you get to college, it's you're really ahead of the game. Yeah, yeah, 100%. I always think about like if I didn't go to this school, like I wouldn't have my best friend. Like my best friend was, my roommate at Taft. Some of my best friends that I speak to every day were, my teammates at Taft. I was just with one of my best friends from Kents Hill, yesterday. He's out in LA. I got my closest friends, are some of my people that I went to boarding school with. I wouldn't change a thing. The connections, the experience, the good times, the bad times, everything. Like if I didn't go to boarding school, I don't know if my football experience would have been the same. I don't know if I would have gotten involved in anything I wasn't supposed to be getting involved in. So in reality, I wouldn't change a thing. I love the boarding school experience, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who is trying to just get, a little more out of their high school experience. Once again, I think there's just certain opportunities that, some of these boarding schools do offer, to some of our students that you may not be able to get at, your normal local public school or your, charter school or Catholic school, whatever it may be. And so, I do highly recommend, trying to get that experience if you do have the opportunity to. Yeah, I would say if you're a parent, I would say for a parent, let your kid, and I see it a lot. I would say let your kid fail, let your kid pick themselves up, and let your kid succeed. Let your kid do all of those things. You have, on these campus, there's a support system and there are faculty here to make sure that, the kid doesn't end up going underwater. We're gonna make sure that, your kid, is getting the most out of the experience. We're gonna make sure that your kid doesn't fall behind. There's a ton of support on these campuses, to make sure that these students are not only going to get the most out of what these out of what these communities have to offer, but also like excel after. From the student perspective, make sure you just put yourself out there. Make sure that you speak to, you speak to people in the dorms. You go outside of your comfort zone. You go outside of your social bubble. Meet some other people. Join clubs. Play a different sport. Do everything. Like try to, I wouldn't say keep yourself busy, but really just put yourself out there and, try to get the most out of the boarding school experience. There's just so much that's on a campus. And, the last thing I've spoken to people who, they only played their one sport, my apologies. They only played their one sport on campus and that's it. They spoke to their teammates. I wish I would have met that person. Oh yeah, I wish I would have did this, so if you are a student, what I mean, on these campuses and trying to navigate through these communities, just spread your wings, man. Spread your wings. I would say be you have to be disciplined. I would say you have to be disciplined. We spoke about time management earlier today. That's huge. There'll be some times where, during study hall, it's not your time to goof off with your boys. It's not time to goof off with your friends because you know that you have to get this work done because you have morning workouts. And you know that you have to make sure that you go to all these classes because you don't want to be in detention during a time where you have morning workouts. And, so just making sure that you understand and value the time that you do have and the free time that you do have. And when you do have, whatever your practice is or whatever these classes, make sure that you're giving the greatest effort in all those spaces, right? You're not going to give, I want to make sure you're not going to give me, 70% in the classroom and then give me 100% on the field. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. You need to make sure that you're giving the maximum amount of effort in all of these spaces on campus, whether it's, in the dorm, right? Whether it's on the practice field, whether it's in the classroom, make sure that you're giving maximum effort throughout all of those things. And you're going to get the most out of it, at the end. I guarantee it. You know, there's no coach or teacher that is going to stretch a kid so thin to the point where they're not able to give all of their effort in all of those facets, all of those spaces in these communities. So just making sure that you remain disciplined, stay true to, what you want to do. And here's the thing, if it's something that you do want to do, you'll figure it out because in reality, this is only a piece of this is only, you know, a sort of a snapshot of what you're going to have to do if you want to play in the next level. It had a direct impact on, you know, where I am today. To be honest, the how I got my first job was, you know, my art teacher, Babs Wilden. She reached out to me, you know, during my senior year of college and asked me if I wanted to, you know, come to Kent Hill. Like as simple as that, right? You know, and you know, that connection, you know, helped me and open up the door for me to, you know, go and teach at Kent Hill. And then after that, you know, the boarding school world is so small. You I would say like I know somebody in every single corner in the boarding school world, whether it's, you know, a teacher that, you know, taught me here, or a teacher that I met at a conference here, or somebody that I went to school with who's now teaching here. And the boarding school world is so small. So being able to have, you know, a decent rapport and a level of respect from either all of your colleagues, friends, you know, anyone that you've, you know, come into, you know, you come across, you know, in terms of in the boarding school community, on the boarding school world, it goes a long way. You know, it had a direct impact on where I am today. You know, the associate head of school who I interviewed with when I, you know, came to Lawrence Academy, her father was my football coach at Taft. You know what I mean? And that's something, once again, that's just a connection that was there. And she was able to reach out to him and ask him about my character. And, you know, he was able to vouch for me. You know, things like that, you know, you just never know. And so there's a, I, I, I would say in terms of how you know, the impact and the connections, it was huge. It was huge because like to this day, you know, I'll speak to somebody who says, oh, you know this person, and then I can vouch for somebody. You know, I was able to vouch for my little cousin to get a job at a boarding school because one of the teachers that taught me at Kent Hill, you know, was a faculty who was interviewing him at that school, and I was able to have that connection. You know, so not only was I able to benefit, but I was able to pass that on and able to help, you know, somebody else, you know, in my family to get the opportunity to teach at a boarding school as well. The fear of, you know, something bad, you know, what happened to your child, a parent's child. I don't think, you know, I don't think that would ever happen. That is a misconception, you know, but there are certain things that, you know, do happen. You know, being homesick, you know, for a kid the first time away from school, that is gonna happen. You know, that is something that, you know, during that orientation period, you know, man, I'm sure you've seen it, you know, during orientation, you have a kid who this is their first time away from home and they're not used to not seeing their parent every single day or every single night, you know, and that's something that they do have to adjust to. And that's something that will happen. But like I said earlier, you know, you have as a parent, you know, you have to let your kid get acclimated and get adjusted to this lifestyle because this is gonna have to happen sooner or later, whether it happens now, whether it happens in college, right? So give your child the chance to, you know, really, you know, get acclimated and adjust to this lifestyle of them being a young adult and them taking care of themselves, you know, and you know, if you're a parent and you know, you're at the student school every single day, you know, checking on them and you want to go, you're not giving them the chance. You're not giving them the chance to grow without you. And you're not giving them the chance, you know, fall and get up just like, you know, when they were riding a bike for the first time. You know, you're not going to hold on to the bike the whole entire time. You have to let go of the bike sooner or later. The training wheels have to come off. You have to let them ride on their own. And it's the same thing with boarding schools. But it does happen, right? You have a ton of kids who do get homesick. And, you know, a phone call home is great, but you know, for the most part, giving these young adults the opportunity to get acclimated and, you know, adjust is huge. Um, I would say, you know, maybe parents have some sort of misconception or, you know, a fear of their child falling behind. And, you know, I don't think there are too many boarding schools who just, and I mentioned this earlier, I don't think there's too many boarding schools, just schools in general that would just, you know, straight up just let a kid fall under. You know, there's so many like safety nets and there are so many like checks that we do as faculty, you know, checking on kids, you know, all right, where's this kid? Where's this kid? Where's this kid? You know, students may think that faculty don't know, but we're our jobs are to make sure that we are keeping tabs on every single kid, whether it's a small school with 200 kids or it's a larger school like Exeter with 1,000. You know, believe it or not, there are eyes on every single kid, and you know, we want to make sure that parents do know that your kid is being watched, your kid is being supervised, your kid is being monitored, and us as faculty are doing our best to make sure that once again, like he's getting the most out of the experience in the academic field, whether it's athletically, in the dorm, we're going to make sure that, we do have eyes and we're doing our best to make sure that they're getting the best out of the experience. I do just want to add that, once again, as parents, one of the big things is just making sure that I think it is good when a student who is new coming to the boarding school experience, I want them to have, sorry, uh, I think it's great when they do see that the parents are also super supportive in this process and super supportive in sharing that and their child having that experience. It was very easy for me to make the transition once again, but I did have parents who already had a child that was in the boarding school community, and they were excited for their next child to do the same. And I think when you are a young kid and if you have a parent that's like, oh, I don't know, but now the kid may second guess whether or not they actually want to take advantage of this opportunity. But I think if you do have a parent that is extremely excited and understands what these schools and the opportunities that these communities have to offer, their child sees that as well. I think the adjustment period will be super smooth, and I think that the child will then flourish, and then they'll be excited to show their parent everything that they're doing on these campuses, and everything that they're involved in, and then introducing them to their friends and their faculty, and just everybody in the dorms and everybody on these campuses. So I think it's super huge, just making sure that we do have supportive parents in the experience, and that's just going to shed a lot of light on those young students who are going to be getting acclimated in these communities.